They told me I didn't live here anymore, standing on my own front porch with a key that suddenly meant nothing. The metal teeth scraping uselessly inside a lock that had been changed while I was halfway across the world. And I remember the smell first, fresh paint, sharp and chemical, drifting through the cracked window like someone had erased every trace of me and replaced it overnight. I stood there in the dark at 2:13 a.m., boots still dusty from a long flight, duffel bag heavy on my shoulder, staring at the house my father built with his own hands. The same porch where he taught me how to sand would smooth and measure twice before cutting once. And now there was a stranger's car in the driveway, a silver SUV I'd never seen before, parked exactly where my old truck used to sit. Like I'd been edited out of my own life, I knocked once slow and controlled, the sound echoing through the door I used to leave unlocked. And when it opened, it wasn't fear I saw, it was confusion, Man about my age holding a rental agreement like a shield, his eyes flicking from my face to the duffel bag, then back again. "Can I help you?" he asked like I was the one trespassing, and that's when something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet, just clarity, because I already knew this wasn't a mistake. This was planned, precise, executed while I was gone, while I was deployed, while I trusted that some things back home didn't change. I stepped back, looked past him into the living room, and it hit harder than anything. My furniture rearranged, my father's old recliner gone, replaced with something modern and clean. My walls repainted a sterile gray, like they'd scrubbed out the history. And then I heard her voice, smooth, controlled, practiced, the kind that smiles while it takes from you. "There he is," she said, stepping into the doorway beside the tenant like she'd been waiting for this moment. Linda Graves, HOA president, perfectly styled, clipboard in hand, even at 2 in the morning, her perfume cutting through the paint fumes like a warning. "You shouldn't be here," she said, tilting her head just enough to make it feel official. And then she handed me the paper, lease agreement with my address printed clean across the top. Dates, signatures, everything looking legitimate at a glance. "The property was classified as abandoned during your extended absence," she continued, voice calm, almost sympathetic like she was explaining a policy, not stealing a home. "We placed it in a temporary rental management for community benefit." Community benefit, I almost laughed, but I didn't because I'd heard that tone before overseas, people dressing up control as protection, theft as order. I asked one question, just one: who authorized this? And her smile didn't even flicker. "The HOA board in accordance with revised bylaws." Revised while I was gone, signed by people who never built a thing in their lives. And then the headlights hit the driveway, slow, deliberate, washing everything in white light. A patrol car rolling to a stop like it had been scheduled, not called. And the officer stepped out, hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning the scene. Like he already knew the script. "Sir, we've received a report of a disturbance," he said. And Linda didn't even look at him, just kept her eyes on me, waiting, confident, like she'd already won. And maybe in that moment, she thought she had, because I nodded, slow, controlled, stepped back off the porch, and said nothing else. Not to her, not to the officer, not to the man standing in my doorway, holding a piece of paper that meant more than my name. For the first time in my life, I walked back to the curb, gravel crunching under my boots, the night air cool against my skin, and I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, stared at the screen for a second longer than I needed to, because I wasn't calling a lawyer, I wasn't calling the police, I was calling someone who understood exactly what happens when you cross a line you didn't even know existed. And as it rang, I looked back at the house, at Linda Graves standing in my doorway like she owned it, and I realized something she hadn't, something none of them had. They thought I came home to fight alone, and that was their first mistake. The phone only rang once before a voice I trusted picked up. Calm, alert, like it always was no matter the hour, and I kept my eyes on that house while I spoke, quiet and precise, giving the address, the situation, the single detail that mattered more than anything else: unauthorized occupation of a service member's primary residence. And there was a pause on the other end, just long enough to tell me everything had shifted. "Stay put," he said, no questions, no hesitation, just that, and the line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and leaned against the curb, the cold edge of concrete pressing through my jeans, watching as Linda continued her performance on the porch, explaining things to the officer with that same polished tone, her hand moving in small controlled gestures like she was presenting a case she had already rehearsed. and the officer nodded along, occasionally glancing over at me like I was a loose thread he did not feel like pulling. The tenant closed the door halfway, unsure which version of reality he belonged to, and for a moment the whole scene felt staged, like I had stepped into someone else's script where I was cast as the problem, not the owner. The night stretched out around us, quiet except for the hum of the patrol car engine and the distant sound of a sprinkler system ticking on somewhere down the block. The smell of fresh paint still hanging in the air, too clean, too new, like they had rushed to cover something up. I noticed the mailbox then. My name was gone, replaced with a printed label that did not belong to me. Small detail, but it hit harder than the lock because that meant paperwork, deliberate change. Someone had filed something somewhere to make this look official, and Linda knew it. She glanced at me once, just once, and there was something in her eyes, not fear, not yet, but expectation, like she was waiting for me to argue, to raise my voice, to give her a reason to escalate. But I did not move, did not speak. I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people reveal more than words ever could. Minutes passed, then more. The officer checked his watch, shifted his weight, clearly ready to wrap this up as a routine call. "Sir, if you do not reside here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property," he said, finally, measured, procedural. And I almost smiled at the phrasing, "if you do not reside here," like it was still a question, like ownership could be decided by whoever spoke last. I pushed off the curb slowly, dust in my hands, and nodded, stepping back another few feet, giving them exactly what they thought they wanted: compliance, distance, no confrontation. Linda relaxed just enough for it to show, her shoulders dropping a fraction, her grip on that clipboard loosening. She turned slightly toward the officer, already transitioning into whatever came next in her plan, probably fines, probably paperwork, maybe even a lien if she thought she could get away with it. And that was the moment the air changed, subtle at first, a low vibration underfoot, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention, the kind of sound you feel before you hear. Engines, more than one, approaching in tight formation, steady and controlled. Not the uneven rhythm of traffic, but something coordinated, intentional. The officer heard it next, his head turning toward the street, hand lifting instinctively to shade his eyes from the headlights cresting the corner. Linda followed his gaze, confusion flickering across her face for the first time. The beams grew brighter, cutting through the dark, reflecting off windows and polished paint. And then the first vehicle rolled into view, black, unmarked, clean lines, stopping not at the curb, but directly in front of the house, followed by another and another, each one pulling in with precise spacing. Engines idling low, doors still closed. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Even the sprinkler down the block clicked off mid-cycle like it knew something had shifted. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, watching as the last vehicle settled into place, 7 in total. Just like I expected, the engines cut almost in unison. And for a split second there was silence again, heavier this time, loaded, and then the first door opened, slow, deliberate, a figure stepping out in crisp uniform. Posture straight, movements efficient, no rush, no wasted motion. And that was when Linda's expression finally broke, not into panic, not yet, but into something closer to realization, like a calculation she had been so confident in suddenly no longer added up. And I took one step forward, just one, the gravel crunching under my boot loud in the quiet street. And I said the only thing I needed to say, calm, steady, certain: "You should have checked who you were renting from." The silence after that door opened felt heavier than anything that came before it, like the entire street was waiting to see which version of reality would hold. And the man who stepped out of that first vehicle did not look at Linda, did not look at the officer. He looked straight at me. A brief nod, professional, precise, the kind of acknowledgement that says everything without a single word. And then the rest of them followed. Doors opening in sequence, boots hitting asphalt in a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat. Each movement controlled, measured, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. And suddenly the quiet suburban street did not feel like hers anymore. It felt like mine again, like it had been recalibrated back to something real. The officer straightened, his posture shifting instinctively as he realized this was no longer a routine call, his hand dropping away from his belt as he stepped forward, trying to regain control of a situation that had clearly moved beyond him. "What is going on here?" he asked, But his voice had lost that earlier certainty, and Linda, for the first time since I'd seen her, did not have an immediate answer. She clutched that clipboard tighter, the edges of the paper bending under her grip, her eyes darting between the vehicles, the uniforms, the quiet authority that had just filled the space she thought she controlled. "This is a private community matter," she said finally, forcing the words out with that same practiced tone. But it did not land the same way anymore. Not with 7 black vehicles idling in front of her borrowed reality. The man in front, Captain Reynolds, stepped forward then, his voice calm, even carrying just enough weight to cut through the tension without raising volume. "This property is registered as the primary residence of an active duty service member," he said, each word deliberate. "Any unauthorized lease or transfer during deployment falls under federal review." And I watched Linda's expression shift again, the confidence cracking further, not in a panic yet, but into something tighter, something calculating, like she was trying to find a version of the rules where she was still in control. "We followed HOA bylaws," she said quickly, almost too quickly, holding up the lease like it was still a shield. "The property was abandoned. We have documentation." And Reynolds did not even glance at the paper. "Abandonment requires legal verification beyond local association authority," he replied, steady, unbothered, "especially when federal protections are in place." And there it was, the word she had not accounted for, federal. It hung in the air like a line she had already crossed without realizing it. The officer shifted again, clearly out of his depth now, his earlier instructions fading into the background as he looked between Linda and Reynolds, unsure where his jurisdiction even applied anymore. And the tenant, still half inside the doorway, lowered the lease slowly, his grip loosening as the situation clarified in a way that had nothing to do with neighborhood rules or printed forms. I stepped forward another pace, close enough now to see the fine details, the fresh paint uneven in the corners, the new locks slightly misaligned, rushed work, quick turnover. They had moved fast, confident no one would challenge it. And that confidence was the only thing keeping Linda upright at this point. "You said this was for community benefit," I said, my voice calm, controlled, no anger, just fact. And she met my eyes, tried to hold that same authority she walked out here with. "It is," she replied, but there was hesitation now, a fraction of a second that had not been there before, and Reynolds glanced at me briefly, then back at her. "Community benefit does not override federal protection statutes," he said, and behind him, one of the others stepped forward with a folder, thick, organized, the kind of documentation that does not get rushed, the kind that gets built carefully, piece by piece, and Linda saw it. I watched her eyes track the movement, the calculation shifting again, faster now, sharper, like she was realizing this was not just a conversation. It was a process already in motion. And for the first time, she stepped back just half a step, but it was enough to tell me everything had changed. The street was not hers anymore. The rules were not hers anymore. And the story she built while I was gone was starting to collapse under its own weight. And I could feel it, not as anger, not as revenge, but as something steadier, something earned, the quiet return of ground that was always mine. And as the folder opened and the first page turned, the sound of paper shifting the night air felt louder than any argument she could make, because this time it was not about who spoke the loudest. It was about who had the truth written down. The paper made a dry, deliberate sound as it turned, the kind of sound that does not rush, that does not care about opinions, only facts. And I watched as Captain Reynolds held it steady under the streetlight, the glow catching the edges of official seals and signatures that did not come from any homeowners association. And Linda saw it too. I could tell by the way her posture stiffened, like she was trying to stand her ground on shifting sand. "We have every right to manage abandoned properties," she said again. But the words came out thinner this time, stretched over something that was already breaking. And Reynolds did not interrupt her. He let her finish, let the silence sit just long enough after. Then he spoke calm, precise. "Sergeant Daniel Hayes filed active deployment status with Federal Housing Protection Registry prior to departure," he said, tapping the page lightly. "That status prevents any third-party occupancy agreements without direct authorization." And there was the piece she never checked, the detail buried deep enough that only someone looking for it would find it. And I remembered the day I filed it, sitting at a worn desk under fluorescent lights, filling out forms that felt routine at the time. Something you do because it is required, not because you think it will save your home one day, but it was right. There in black and white. And Linda's eyes flicked to me then, sharp, searching, like she was trying to measure how much I knew, how much control she had already lost. That documentation was never provided to the association. She replied quickly, pivoting, adjusting, trying to rebuild her footing. We acted on available information, and Reynolds nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Available information does not override federal protection, he said, and behind him the folder shifted again. Another page, another detail, layers she had not accounted for. The officer took a step back, creating space now instead of enforcing it. His role reduced to observer as the structure of authority rearranged itself right in front of him, and the tenant finally stepped fully outside. The lease now hanging loosely at his side, his earlier confidence gone, replaced with something more cautious, more aware. I did not know, he said quietly, almost to himself, and I believed him because this was never about him. He was just part of the system she built, a piece placed where it benefited her most. Linda did not respond to him, her focus locked on Reynolds, on the folder, on the reality unfolding in measured, documented steps. This is a misunderstanding, she said, softer now, recalibrating again. We can resolve this internally. And that word, internally, sounded smaller than it had before, like it no longer held the same weight in a street filled with federal presence. I stepped closer to the porch, the wood creaking under my boot in a way that felt familiar, grounding, and I reached out, running my fingers lightly along the railing my father had built. The surface smooth from years of use, still solid under the new paint. They had covered it, but they had not changed it, and that mattered more than anything she had printed on that paper. Reynolds closed a folder halfway, not ending anything, just marking a shift. This would not be handled internally, he said, and the words settled into the space like a final adjustment, precise and irreversible. Linda's grip on the clipboard tightened again, but looked different now, less like authority, more like something she was holding on to because she did not know what else to do. You are overstepping, she said, a last attempt to reclaim control, and Reynolds met her gaze evenly. No, ma'am, he replied. This is exactly where jurisdiction begins. And the air felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but aligned, like everything had clicked into place after being out of sync. The officer cleared his throat slightly, stepping forward just enough to acknowledge the shift. Do you need assistance with anything further? He asked, directing it to Reynolds now, not to Linda. And that small change said more than anything else. The structure had moved, and it was not moving back. I stood there, just inside the edge of my own property, feeling the weight of it settle, not as relief, not yet, but as certainty, the kind that does not need to be spoken out loud because it is already written down, already filed, already in motion. And as the next page turned in that folder, the quiet street that had tried to erase me started giving everything back, piece by piece. The night air felt different now, like the street itself had stepped back and decided to watch, and I could hear it in the small details, the faint ticking of a cooling engine, the distant hum of power lines, even the soft rustle of paper as Reynolds flipped to the next section of that folder. And every sound carried weight, because nothing here was casual anymore. Nothing here belonged to her version of control. Linda shifted her stance on the porch, heels clicking once against the wood before. She steadied herself, that polished composure tightening again like she was trying to rebuild the image she walked out with earlier. There must be some procedural error, she said, her voice measured but thinner now. We followed community protocol, and the word protocol hung there like it still meant something, like it could stand up against everything unfolding in front of her. Reynolds did not raise his voice, did not need to. Community protocol does not supersede federal housing protections, he said, steady as before, and your association does not have authority to reclassify occupancy status for deployed personnel. And I watched the realization land, not all at once, but in layers, like each word was pulling something loose inside the structure she had built. The officer shifted again, stepping slightly to the side, creating a clear line between himself and her. Not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to show where he stood now. and the tenant took another step down from the doorway, putting actual distance between himself and the house, like he no longer wanted to be connected to whatever this was becoming. "Am I supposed to leave?" he asked quietly, looking at me, not at her, and that was the moment everything flipped completely. Not because of what was said, but because of who he asked. I nodded once, calm. "You were given bad information," I told him. "This was never your lease to sign." And he exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath since the door first opened. And he stepped fully onto the walkway, lowering the paper in his hand as if it had lost all. "Wait," Linda turned sharply toward him. "You are under a valid agreement," she snapped, trying to pull him back in her version of authority, but it did not land. Not anymore, because the room had changed, the rules had changed, and she could feel it slipping. Reynolds closed the folder completely this time, not as an ending, but as a transition. "Ma'am, we're going to need all documentation related to this lease, including board approvals and any communication regarding the property status," he said, and there was no room for negotiation in the way he said it. Just process, just inevitability, and Linda hesitated just long enough to make it obvious. "I will have to consult with the board," she replied, defaulting to structure, to layers of delay, but Reynolds shook his head slightly. "You can consult with whoever you need," he said, "but the request stands effective immediately." And the word immediately settled in like a final piece. No extensions, no waiting, no space to maneuver. I stepped onto the first plank of the porch, the wood creaking under my weight in a way that felt grounding, real, something that had not changed no matter how much paint they threw over it. And I looked. At the door, the new lock, the clean edges, the small scratch where my key had failed to turn, and I reached in my pocket, pulling out the original key again, holding it between my fingers for a second, feeling the worn edges that matched the shape of my hand, my history, and I did not try the lock this time. I just held it because I did not need to prove anything anymore. The proof was already here, already documented, already moving through channels she could not control. Linda watched me, her expression shifting again, faster now, less controlled. "This is not over," she said, and it sounded less like a statement and more like something she needed to believe. And I met her eyes, steady, not raising my voice, not stepping closer, just standing on ground that was always mine. "No," I said, "it just started being handled the right way." And behind me, another vehicle door opened, a different kind of presence stepping out this time. Not uniformed in the same way, but carrying the same quiet authority. And as the faint rustle of another set of documents filled the air, I realized something simple and absolute. She thought this was about a house, but she had stepped into something much bigger the moment she decided she could rewrite who it belonged to. The second figure stepped into the light with a different kind of presence. Not military, not local law enforcement, but something quieter and heavier at the same time. A tailored jacket instead of a uniform, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm. And the way Reynolds gave him a brief nod told me everything I needed to know. This was not escalation. This was procedure moving forward exactly as it was supposed to. The man walked up the driveway at an unhurried pace, shoes crunching lightly against gravel, eyes scanning the property once, taking in the details without reacting to any of them. And when he stopped beside Reynolds, he did not look at Linda first. He looked at me. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, extending a hand, firm, direct. "Michael Turner, Federal Housing Compliance." And his voice carried that same steady tone I had been hearing all night, calm, certain, grounded in something that did not need to prove itself. I shook his hand once, short and deliberate, then stepped back, giving him space to do what he came here to do, because this was no longer about presence. This was about documentation, process, and consequences. Turner turned to Linda then, opening his folder with a smooth motion that felt practiced, routine. Like this was not his first time walking into a situation where someone thought local authority was enough. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to review all documentation related to the occupancy transfer of this property," he said, and his tone did not change. Not when she crossed her arms, not when she lifted her chin slightly like she was about to push back again. "As I said before, this is a private association matter," she replied, holding on to the same line she had been using all night, but it sounded thinner now, like a script that no longer matched the scene. Turner nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them. Private associations do not have authority to override federally protected occupancy rights for active duty personnel, he said, and then he reached into his folder, pulling out a single sheet, holding it just enough into the light for the header to catch. Official seal, clear language, nothing vague about it. This notice outlines the violation parameters and the immediate requirement for compliance. He continued, and I saw it land, really land this time, not as a crack in her confidence, but as a shift in understanding. This was no longer something she could talk her way out of. This was something that had already been defined, measured, and filed. The tenant shifted again beside the walkway, glancing between Turner and me, clearly realizing he had stepped into something far beyond a simple rental. "Do I need to vacate tonight?" he asked, and Turner looked at him, not dismissive, not cold, just clear. "You were placed under an invalid agreement," he said. "You will be given proper notice and relocation. Guidance through the appropriate channels." And the tenant nodded slowly, relief and uncertainty mixing in his expression. But at least now there was direction, structure, something real to follow. Linda exhaled sharply, the sound breaking the rhythm that had settled into the street. "This is excessive," she said, her voice tightening again. "We acted in good faith based on the information we had." And Turner closed his folder halfway, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "Good faith does not negate statutory protection," he replied, "and the absence of verification does not transfer ownership rights." Each word precise, measured, like they had been written long before this moment and were simply being applied where they belonged. I leaned against the porch railing again, the wood solid under my hand, the same structure that had been here long before any HOA board, long before any revised bylaws, and I could feel the weight of everything settling into place, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a system correcting itself. Reynolds stepped slightly to the side, allowing Turner to take the lead completely now, the roles shifting without a word, without resistance. Because this was how it worked when things moved from local assumptions to federal reality. Linda looked down at the paper in Turner's hand, then back at her clipboard, then at the house behind her. And for the first time, there was no immediate response, no polished line ready to go, just a pause, small but unmistakable. And in that pause, I saw it clearly, the moment she realized this was not a situation she controlled anymore. This was a process she had triggered, and processes like this did not stop because someone asked them to. They moved forward step by step, documented, recorded, and as Turner placed the notice carefully against her clipboard, aligning it with the edge like it belonged there all along, I understood something simple and final. This was never about forcing my way back in. This was about letting the right system walk in for me. And now that it had, there was nothing she could do to push it back out. The notice rested against her clipboard like it had always belonged there, edges perfectly aligned, official seal catching the porch light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for a moment nobody moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because everything that came next had already been decided somewhere far above this quiet street. Linda stared at it, eyes scanning the header, the language, the section she clearly did not recognize, and I watched the shift happen in real time. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow unraveling of certainty, the kind that comes when you realize the rules you have been using do not apply anymore. Turner did not rush her. He simply stepped back half a pace, giving the process space to breathe. "You will have 48 hours to provide full documentation," he said, voice even. "During that time, no further actions regarding this property may be taken by the association, and the word may carry weight, not as a suggestion, but as a boundary that had just been drawn in ink." Linda lifted her chin slightly, trying to hold on to something, anything that still felt like control. "And if we comply?" she asked, her tone sharper now, searching for an outcome she could still shape. Turner closed his folder completely this time, the soft click of leather settling into place, sounding louder than it should have. "Then the review process continues," he replied. "If you do not, it escalates, simple, direct, no room for interpretation." And I could see it in her eyes, that word escalates. It landed differently than everything else because it hinted at something beyond paperwork, beyond fines, something structural that could not be undone with a meeting or a vote. The tenant shifted again, stepping further down the walkway, putting real distance between himself and the porch now, like he was physically separating himself for whatever consequences were forming. "I will start packing tonight," he said quietly, and Turner gave a small nod, acknowledging without making it a command, because that part was not about enforcement, it was about correction. The officer finally relaxed his stance completely, one hand resting loosely at his side, the tension that had been holding him earlier now gone, replaced with something closer to observation. He was no longer managing the scene, he was witnessing it, and Linda noticed that too, her eyes flicking briefly toward him, searching for the support she had leaned on before, but it was not there anymore. The structure had shifted, and it was not shifting back. I stepped fully onto the porch then, the wood solid beneath my boots, each step familiar, grounding, the faint creak underfoot sounding exactly the same as it had years ago, unchanged by fresh paint or new locks. And I stopped just short of the door, not reaching for it yet, just standing there, feeling the space settle around me. The house did not feel occupied anymore, not in the way it had minutes ago. It felt paused, like it was waiting for everything to be set right before it let anything move again. Linda turned toward me slowly, her expression tighter now, less composed. "You could have handled this differently," she said, and there was something almost personal in it now, like she was trying to reframe what had happened into something smaller, something she could still understand. I looked at her, steady, not raising my voice, not stepping closer. "I did," I said. "I handled it the way the law requires." And the words did not need emphasis. They just needed to exist. Turner glanced between us once, then back at his watch, not impatient, just tracking time the way someone does when the next step is already scheduled. Reynolds gave another small nod in my direction, acknowledgement, respect, and then he stepped back toward the vehicles, the others following without needing instruction. Doors opening again, engines starting one by one, the low hum returning to the street like a controlled release of tension. Linda remained where she was, the notice still pressed against her clipboard, her fingers gripping the edge tighter than before. And for the first time since I'd seen her, she did not speak, did not correct, did not explain. She just stood there, watching as the structure she'd built around this place quietly dissolved under something stronger, something she never accounted for. And as the first vehicle pulled away, headlights sweeping across the front of the house, catching the new paint, the new lock, the small details she thought made hers, I realized those were never the things that mattered. Ownership was not in the paint or the paperwork she created. It was in what held up when everything else was tested. And right now, the only thing still standing exactly as it should was the truth that had been there all along. The last engine faded down the street, leaving behind a silence that felt earned, not empty. And for the first time since I stepped onto this curb, the air did not feel contested. It felt settled, like the house itself had been holding its breath and finally let it go. I stood on the porch a few seconds longer, listening to the quiet details return, the distant hum of a refrigerator inside, the faint creak of wood adjusting under night air, familiar sounds that had been buried under everything else. And I reached for the door again, not to force it this time, just to rest my hand against it, feeling the cool surface, the slight unevenness where the new paint had dried too fast. Rushed work, careless in ways that mattered. The tenant moved behind me, footsteps light, controlled. "I will be out before morning," he said, voice low, and I nodded without turning, because this was never about him. It was about the space being corrected, not taken back by force, but restored piece by piece. The right way. I heard Linda shift behind me, the soft scrape of her heel on the porch, and when I turned, she looked different, not defeated, not yet, but recalibrating, quieter, the edges of that polished authority worn down by something she could not argue with. "You think this ends here?" she said, not as sharp as before, more like she was testing the words, seeing if they still held weight. I met her eyes, steady. "No," I said. "It ends when everything is put back the way it was supposed to be," and that was the part she had never understood. This was not about winning. It was about alignment, about systems correcting what had been pushed out of place. She looked down at the notice again, fingers tightening slightly along the edge, and I could see the calculations still running. What could be fixed? What could be delayed? What could still be controlled? But the answers were not there anymore, not on that page. Not in this moment. She stepped back once, just enough to clear the doorway, not a gesture of surrender, but something closer to recognition. And that was all I needed. I turned the knob slowly, feeling the resistance of a lock that no longer belonged, and stopped, not pushing it open. Not yet, because this was not about forcing entry. This was about doing it right. I stepped back down from the door, reaching into my pocket, pulling out my phone again, dialing a number I had not used in years. A locksmith who had worked on this house before. Someone who knew the structure, the original fittings, the way things were supposed to be. The call connected, and I gave him the address. Simple, direct, no explanation needed. "I will be there in 20 minutes, he said, and I slipped the phone away, turning back toward the house, toward the porch, toward everything that had almost been rewritten without me. The tenant moved past Linda carefully, carrying a small bag now, giving her space without looking at her, and she did not stop him, did not say a word, because there was nothing left she could say that would change what had already been set in motion. The streetlights cast long shadows across the yard, stretching the lines of the fence, the walkway, the porch, and I saw it clearly then. The house had not changed. Not really. The structure was still mine, the foundation still solid. All she had done was cover it, temporarily, and now that cover was peeling back, revealing exactly what had always been there. I stepped off the porch and onto the walkway. Gravel crunching under my boots, the same sound that greeted me years ago, the same rhythm that marked this place as home, and I leaned against the railing again, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, but for the final piece to fall into place, the one that would make everything official, undeniable. And as I stood there, watching the windows reflect the quiet street, I realized something simple. She thought control came from being the loudest voice in the room, but real control, real ownership, it did not need to speak at all. It just waited until everything else ran out of ways to pretend. The locksmith's truck rolled up right on time, headlights sweeping across the front of the house like a final inspection. And when he stepped out, I could see it in his face immediately, recognition, not of me, but of the place, the structure, the way things were supposed to be before someone tried to rewrite them. He walked up the path with a small metal case in his hand, boots steady on the gravel. And when he reached the porch, he paused, glancing at the lock, then at me. "This isn't the original hardware," he said, simple, factual, and I shook my head once. "No, it isn't," and that was all he needed. No explanation, no story, just the truth of the situation laid out in front of him. He set the case down, opened it with a soft click, tools neatly arranged inside like everything else that had shown up tonight, precise, intentional, built for a purpose. Linda was still there, standing just off to the side, clipboard in hand, but she had not said a word since the vehicles left, not since the notice had been placed in front of her. And now she just watched, silent, as the last piece of her control slipped into something she could not interrupt. The locksmith worked carefully, no rush, no force, just methodical movement, checking alignment, testing tension, the faint metallic clicks sounding sharp in the quiet air. And after a moment, he stopped, pulling back slightly. "They installed this fast," he said, almost to himself, "cut corners on the fitting," and I nodded because that was the pattern. Rushed decisions, rushed actions, built on the assumption that no one would come back to question them. But I had, and not alone. He adjusted his tool once more, a final small movement, and then there was a soft shift, almost unnoticeable, but I felt it more than heard it. The mechanism giving way, not breaking, just releasing like it had been waiting for the right hand to set it straight. He stepped back, closing the case. "It is open," he said, and he did not reach for the handle, did not push the door, because that part was not his, that part was mine. I stepped forward, slowly placing my hand on the knob again, feeling the difference immediately. No resistance, no misalignment, just a clean, solid connection, the way it was meant to be. I turned it, smooth this time, and the door opened inward with a quiet creak, the sound carrying through the entryway like something waking up. I did not rush inside. I just stood there for a second, looking into the space that had been changed, repainted, rearranged, but not erased. The structure was still there, the bones of it, the way the hallway lined up with the living room, the angle of the light coming through the far window, all the things that could not be altered by paperwork or paint. The tenant's footsteps moved, somewhere behind me, heading toward the street now, leaving without being told, without needing direction, because the situation had corrected itself. Linda shifted once more, the faintest movement, and when I glanced back, she was looking at the open door, not at me, Not at the locksmith, but at the space she had tried to claim, and there was nothing left in her expression that resembled control. Just calculation fading into something